She counted money for the Lucchese family for the better part of 2 decades. She hid narcotics from federal agents inside her own home. She slept with the second most powerful man in her husband's crew while that husband sat in a prison cell 300 miles away. And when the whole operation finally came apart in the spring of 1980, when Henry Hill decided the fastest way out of a life sentence was to burn every man who had ever trusted him, Karen Hill did not get a new identity out of gratitude. She got one because the same men she'd spent 20 years learning to survive now wanted her dead too. Hollywood gave that story 90 seconds of screen time and called it done. This is the version they left on the floor. Chapter 1. Lawrence. There's a photograph that's circulated online in recent years, grainy, black and white, unmistakably a police booking shot. 2 faces. Henry Hill on the left, already wearing the specific hollowed-out look of a man calculating his odds. Karen Hill on the right, jaw set, eyes not quite meeting the camera. April 1980. Long Island. The day the entire architecture of their marriage collapsed into a federal file number. Nobody looking at that photograph would guess where the woman in it actually came from. Lawrence, New York sits at the western edge of the 5 towns, the string of villages that make up the more affluent stretch of Nassau County's South Shore. In 1946, the year Karen Friedman was born, it was a place organized around a specific and largely unspoken set of expectations. Jewish families who had worked hard enough, for long enough, to leave the crowded blocks of the city behind and plant something more permanent on Long Island. Good schools. Manicured lawns that got mowed on a schedule nobody had to enforce because everyone already agreed on it. A community small enough that everybody's business eventually became everybody's business, whether they wanted it to or not. Her father worked. Her mother ran the household with the specific, unbending competence of a woman who understood exactly how much was riding on appearances in a neighborhood like theirs. Karen had 2 sisters. The house was orderly in the way houses get when the people inside them have already agreed, without saying so out loud, on what a good life is supposed to look like. That agreement did not survive contact with Karen. Not because she rebelled loudly. Nothing in the record of her early life suggests a defiant teenager sneaking out windows or picking fights at the dinner table. What set her apart, according to the people who knew her then, was quieter and harder to name. A kind of attentiveness that outran her age. She watched rooms the way some people listened to music, picking out the parts other people missed. Which relative was lying about money? Which neighbor's marriage had already ended even though nobody had said so publicly yet? It's the kind of skill that looks like nothing at 19 and turns out, 20 years later, to be the exact skill that keeps you alive inside a criminal organization built almost entirely on secrets. She trained as a dental hygienist, which was, for a young Jewish woman from the 5 towns in the early 1960s, close to the platonic ideal of a respectable trade. Steady hours, clean work, a career that fit neatly around the marriage everyone assumed was coming. To a man everyone assumed would be a doctor, a lawyer, or at minimum someone whose father belonged to the same country club as hers. Nobody in Lawrence was raising daughters to marry into the Lucchese crime family. And yet the geography made it more possible than anyone in that neighborhood liked to admit. Long Island in the 1960s sat close enough to the outer boroughs, close enough to Queens and Brooklyn, that organized crime money and organized crime people moved through it constantly, buying summer homes 2 streets over from Judges, eating at restaurants where the maitre d' knew exactly which families owned which tables and said nothing about it to anyone. You could grow up in the 5 towns and never once shake hands with a made man. You could also grow up 2 blocks over and marry into a crew before you turned 20. Proximity wasn't destiny. It was just opportunity, sitting there waiting to see who noticed it. Karen noticed it on a double date in 1965. She wasn't looking for it. A friend of hers was dating Paul Vario Jr., son of a Brooklyn capo named Paul Vario, who ran a substantial piece of the rackets across that part of the city, and the friend needed someone to round out the table. That's the entire mechanism. No grand seduction, no criminal underworld reaching out to claim her. A bad blind date, arranged the way bad blind dates always are, that happened to be sitting on top of a fault line neither young woman at that table had any reason to see. Across from Karen that night sat a 22-year-old named Henry Hill. Chapter 2. The boy who talked too fast. He talked too much. That's the detail Karen herself has consistently pointed to when describing the first time she met Henry Hill, and it's worth taking seriously rather than reading past it as a throwaway line. Henry, by every account from that period, ran on a specific kind of restless, performative energy, the manner of a man perpetually doing math about who else in the room mattered and whether he was being watched by the right people. Karen picked up on it instantly. She had grown up around confident men who didn't need to announce their confidence quite so loudly. Henry's version struck her, at first, as exactly what it was, a performance not yet earned. They made plans for a second date, the ordinary follow-through of two people who'd had an unremarkable but not disqualifying first meeting. Henry didn't show. Consider what should have happened next. A 20-year-old dental hygienist from a respectable family gets stood up by a loud, restless hustler from the outer boroughs. That's an anecdote. That's a story you tell at a dinner party 15 years later about a rude boy who wasn't worth a second thought. Instead, it became page one of a marriage that would run 24 years and end with a federal witness relocation. What actually changed her mind isn't something Karen has ever laid out in granular detail, but the outline is clear enough from what her own family has said in the decades since. Henry came back around. He was, whatever else can be said about him, genuinely funny in the specific, fast, self-deprecating way that can disarm someone who has already decided to be annoyed. He took her to the Copacabana, walking her through a side door past a line that stretched around the block, seated up front without so much as a raised eyebrow from the staff. For a girl from Lawrence, that kind of access made an argument all on its own, separate from anything Henry actually said. It said, "Watch what the world does when it bends for someone instead of the other way around." Here is the part of the story that matters more than the nightclub, though. Karen was not naive about what Henry did for a living. This gets flattened in almost every retelling, including the films, into a story about a woman slowly discovering a terrible secret. That is not what happened, and it's not what she has ever herself claimed happened. She understood, in general terms, what world Henry moved through almost from the beginning. Anybody raised where she was raised would have understood it. The real question in front of her was never whether she knew. It was whether she cared enough to walk away. By the time that question would have mattered, she had already decided she didn't. Chapter 3. What the Copacabana actually sold. Access functions as its own kind of argument, and it's worth being precise about exactly what Henry was selling Karen during the months they dated, because it wasn't simply glamour in the abstract. It was a specific, repeatable experience of frictionlessness. Every ordinary obstacle other people navigated, lines, reservations, bills, simply dissolved the moment Henry walked into a room. Karen got to watch that happen, over and over, at an age when most young women her background were watching their fathers argue with a maitre d' about a table by the kitchen. None of it erased the underlying reality. She understood, and came to understand in increasing detail as the relationship deepened, that this frictionlessness had a source, and the source was organized crime. Certain absences went unexplained. Certain visitors came to the house and left again without introduction. Certain conversations stopped cold the moment she walked into a room, then resumed once she'd left it. This was the tuition. Most relationships extract some version of that exchange, a blind "I turned in return for something valued more." Karen's version simply carried stakes that most relationships never approach. Her parents fought the relationship hard, and for a period that fight became its own kind of pressure test. Henry was not Jewish. Henry did not, whatever he claimed about his prospects, have anything resembling a stable or legitimate future in front of him. Karen's mother in particular pushed back with a persistence that, in the way these things sometimes work, may have deepened Karen's attachment rather than weakening it. Told repeatedly that a man is wrong for you, a young woman sometimes hears underneath the warning an argument for exactly why he might be right, not because the warning is false, but because the warning starts to sound like one more version of the small, predetermined life she is trying to get out from under. There is one specific incident from this courtship period that tells you more about who Karen was becoming than almost anything else on record. According to an account her own daughter, Gina Hill, later put into print, a neighbor of Karen's named Ted made an aggressive pass at her that crossed well past flirtation into assault. She fought him off, slapped him hard enough that he backed off, and shoved her out of his car in anger before driving away. Shaken, she called Henry. What happened next tells you everything. Henry didn't sit with her and process what had happened the way a boyfriend from her old life might have. He drove to her, brought her home, and then crossed the street to where Ted lived. He grabbed him by the hair, pulled a gun from his pocket, and pistol-whipped him in the open air of a residential street. He walked back across the road sweating, handed Karen the still-warm gun, and told her to hide it. Most young women in that position, Gina Hill later wrote, recounting her mother's own version of the story, would have been terrified. Karen said she found it sexy. Sit with that for a second, because it is the clearest single data point available for understanding the entire rest of her life. She held a warm weapon in her hands after watching a man get beaten bloody on her account, and instead of recoiling, she felt something closer to attraction. That is not a detail that fits neatly into the sympathetic, slightly overwhelmed version of Karen Hill that later showed up on movie screens. It suggests a woman who understood, early and at a level below conscious articulation, that Henry's willingness to be violent on her behalf functioned as a form of devotion. That's not a healthy foundation by any modern measure. It was, however, an entirely functional foundation for the specific kind of marriage she was about to enter. One where a woman's sense of safety came not from the absence of danger, but from being correctly positioned on the winning side of it. She also, that night, actively participated in destroying evidence of a crime committed in her name. She hid the gun. She never reported the assault. Everything that came 15 years later, the drugs stashed around a house under federal surveillance, the specific and granular knowledge of who owed what to whom inside a criminal organization, traces its lineage back to a Long Island street where a 19-year-old dental hygienist decided, without much internal debate, that hiding evidence was simply what you did for the man who protected you. Chapter 4. North Carolina. They eloped in 1965. Karen was 19. North Carolina. A courthouse, a license, and none of the ceremony her mother would have insisted on if given the months of planning time a conventional wedding requires. There's something close to defiance in the choice of location, a decision made fast enough and far enough from home that nobody with the standing to stop it could organize a real effort in time. It didn't stay that clean. Once the marriage existed as fact rather than threat, Karen's family pivoted, the way families sometimes do once a fight is already lost, from resistance to damage control. A second ceremony followed back home, large, traditionally Jewish, designed to give the union a social legitimacy the courthouse marriage had entirely skipped. Most of Henry's associates attended. That detail is worth sitting with, because it captures how thoroughly the two worlds had already merged by the time Karen stood under a chuppah surrounded by men her mother had spent months hoping she'd never speak to again. The newlyweds moved in with Karen's parents at first. That single fact undercuts any temptation to picture Henry sweeping her instantly into mob-funded luxury. The glamour built gradually, tracking Henry's rising status inside Paul Vario's crew rather than arriving all at once. And for a period after the wedding, Karen was still, in the most literal sense, sleeping in a room down the hall from the mother who had fought her marriage from the start. It's not hard to imagine the tension in that house. A young bride freshly married against her family's wishes, living under the roof of the woman who'd made the strongest case against exactly this outcome. If Karen carried private doubts during those months, she left no record of voicing them. Within a relatively short window, Henry's earning power inside Vario's operation grew enough for the couple to move into a place of their own, and the real education began. Chapter 5. The rules nobody wrote down. Nobody sat Karen down and explained how to be a wife inside Paul Vario's crew. There was no manual. She learned the way most women in that world learned, by watching, by making mistakes, and by absorbing corrections delivered as casual asides rather than formal instruction. Rule 1 concerned questions. You didn't ask them. Not about money, not about where Henry had been, not about the men who showed up at the house and left envelopes on the kitchen counter without introducing themselves. The operating theory in that world held that wives who didn't ask couldn't accidentally tell, and wives who couldn't accidentally tell were safer for everyone, themselves included. Karen absorbed this fast. Whatever curiosity she'd carried out of her old life as a sharp-eyed, observant girl from Lawrence, she learned to direct only toward the things she was meant to notice, never toward the things she was meant to leave alone. Rule 2 concerned money, and this one took longer to master, because the money itself moved strangely compared to anything in her upbringing. It came in bursts. A new car in the driveway one month, a household scraping by the next while Henry sorted out whatever had gone wrong with a stalled job. She learned the rhythm well enough to manage a household on it, neither panicking during the lean stretches nor overspending during the flush ones. A discipline that stood in sharp contrast to Henry's own habits, which ran reckless in both directions. Rule 3 concerned knowledge, and it's the one that matters most to the rest of this story. Wives in Vario's world were expected to know things, not everything, and never anything they'd admit to a stranger, but enough to function as active, useful partners rather than passive dependents kept deliberately in the dark. Over the years, Karen came to know which men in Henry's orbit could be trusted and which couldn't. She learned to read the specific tension in his voice that meant a job had gone bad versus the different tension that meant a job had simply been delayed. She sorted visitors at the door into categories of welcome, tolerated, and dangerous, the same instinct she'd once applied to guests at her mother's dinner parties, now aimed at an entirely different kind of company. By the early 1970s, less than a decade into the marriage, Karen Hill was not the wife of a wise guy in any passive sense. She had built a working, granular understanding of how an entire branch of organized crime actually functioned. She knew where cash got hidden and how. She knew which of Henry's associates would hold firm under pressure and which would fold at the first sign of trouble. She understood, well before most outsiders would have guessed it, that the entire arrangement carried an expiration date built into its own foundation. She stayed anyway. Chapter 6. The Hijackings. Specificity matters here, because vague gestures toward she knew what Henry did undersell just how detailed her working knowledge actually became. Henry's early earning ran heavily through hijacking, trucks pulled over on stretches of highway, drivers intimidated into silent compliance, cargo moved through a network of fences stretching across Queens and Brooklyn. Karen wasn't present for the jobs themselves. She understood their mechanics well enough, though, to help manage the aftermath. Sudden influxes of cash that needed either explaining or, far more often, needed not explaining to anyone likely to ask. She understood loan sharking with equal precision, the way debts compounded past any hope of repayment, the way interest accrued into something closer to a leash than a financial arrangement, the specific mechanics of how a man who fell behind found himself trapped in an obligation that had nothing to do with courts and everything to do with fear. And she understood, with real granularity, how cash actually moved once it entered her own household. It didn't sit in a bank account under Henry Hill's name. It moved through the house in patterns that required active management. Hidden in specific, chosen locations, converted into goods that could be resold or simply used without drawing attention, spent deliberately in ways designed to avoid looking like a pattern to anyone watching from outside. By the time federal investigators finally turned their full attention on Henry directly, near the end of the 1970s, Karen's knowledge had expanded to cover its most dangerous margin yet: the narcotics trafficking that had become Henry's primary business in the years following his release from a 1974 sentence. She understood the rough shape of the supply chain. She knew which of Henry's partners could be trusted with sensitive information and which, correctly as it turned out, could not. And in the most legally direct sense possible, she participated in concealing physical evidence, helping hide product from law enforcement during a period when the operation was already under surveillance and beginning, slowly, to come apart. Her legal exposure during this period has always been described in the available record as debatable, a word doing quiet work to cover for the fact that nobody has ever fully clarified how much criminal liability Karen actually carried. What isn't debatable is the fact the word is dancing around. She helped hide drugs from federal agents. The film's version, a single panicked afternoon flushing narcotics down a toilet, compresses what was, by the weight of the surrounding record, a longer and more deliberate pattern stretched across years, not one frantic scene. Chapter 7. The Children. Karen and Henry had 2 children, Greg and Gina, and there is no clean answer to the question of how you raise a family inside a criminal enterprise without the children absorbing either its danger or its moral confusion. Karen tried anyway, for years, with a determination that shows up clearly in the accounts both her children eventually gave as adults. The material comfort was real, if unpredictable. New cars appeared in the driveway, with a regularity unusual for their income level on paper. closets filled with clothes purchased without much attention paid to cost. Gina Hill's memoir describes a childhood that looked, from any outside vantage point, like affluence that never quite explained its own source and was never expected to. Alongside that comfort, the children absorbed a set of instincts about secrecy most kids never have to develop. They learned early which questions not to ask their father. They learned to recognize a specific quality of household tension that meant something serious was happening, distinct from ordinary family stress. They understood, in the vague but functional way children understand things adults never explain directly, that their father's work bore no resemblance to other fathers' work, and that saying so outside the house, to a teacher, to a friend, carried consequences nobody wanted to spell out for them. Karen managed this environment with a combination of normalcy and vigilance that, whatever else can be said about the choices she made, reflects genuine parental effort. She kept a functioning household running underneath the instability. She met her children's daily needs with the same competence she'd already built managing the family's finances and its dangerous social relationships. She built, to whatever extent the underlying reality permitted, an experience of childhood that felt stable from the inside, even while its foundation was anything but. That effort would be tested harder than she could have anticipated once Henry's 1974 sentencing sent him to prison. And harder still, later, once witness protection turned disruption from an occasional feature of the children's lives into its entire operating principle. Chapter 8. The Other Women. No honest account of this marriage can skip past Henry's infidelity, because it shaped Karen's marriage from remarkably early on, and it directly set up the choice she would eventually make with Paul Vario. Henry Hill was, by essentially every account including his own, a chronic and largely unapologetic womanizer across most of his marriage to Karen. This wasn't a late development that arrived once the relationship soured. It began early and continued, with varying degrees of discretion, for the better part of 2 decades. Goodfellas dramatizes an affair with a mistress named Janice, and on this specific point, the film's version tracks reasonably close to the documented reality. Henry kept women outside his marriage as a matter of habit, not exception. Karen's response evolved. In the earlier years, by most accounts, she reacted the way most people react to discovered infidelity, with anger, with confrontation, the volatility the film captures in its more heightened domestic scenes. Over time, that reaction hardened into something closer to grim, practical tolerance, not acceptance exactly, but a recognition that Henry's behavior wasn't changing and that leaving carried its own dangers and costs that staying, for all its indignities, did not. There's a particular irony worth naming, one the film gestures toward without quite spelling it out. In one of Goodfellas' more pointed scenes, Paul Cicero, the character built directly on Paul Vario, confronts Henry about his infidelity on Karen's behalf, telling him he knows how to talk to her, especially her. Audiences without outside context read this as ordinary mob paternalism, an older capo stepping in to protect an associate's wife's dignity. Set against what actually happened between Karen and Vario during Henry's imprisonment, the line carries an entirely different weight. Vario didn't know how to talk to her. He would go on to prove it in the most direct way possible. By the time Henry was sentenced to 10 years for extortion in 1974, the marriage had already absorbed years of one-directional betrayal. Years of Karen managing not just the practical demands of life inside organized crime, but the emotional weight of a husband who treated fidelity as optional while expecting total loyalty from her in return. What happened next, during the years Henry spent behind bars, would even that account in a way nobody in the family, least of all Henry, ever fully processed. Chapter 9, 1974. Henry's sentencing to 10 years for extortion marked the hardest break point in Karen's adult life to that point. Harder in some ways than anything still ahead, because it arrived without warning of the larger collapse still years away. Men in Henry's world expected prison eventually. What they didn't necessarily expect, and what Karen learned in the sharpest possible terms, was what actually happened to a wife and children once the household's earner disappeared behind federal walls for what could have been the better part of a decade. Karen was left, effectively overnight, managing a household that had never operated on anything resembling a conventional income, with no steady paycheck to fall back on, no institutional support structure built for the wife of an incarcerated organized crime associate, and 2 young children whose needs didn't pause simply because their fathers had. What made this period genuinely bitter rather than merely difficult was the crew's response to Karen's sudden vulnerability. In theory, organized crime operates on a code that includes taking care of an incarcerated member's family. In practice, according to accounts Karen and her children have given over the years, that support was inconsistent at best and in stretches essentially absent. Men who had eaten at Henry and Karen's table for years, who had accepted Henry's loyalty without complaint, largely failed to step up in any meaningful way once he could no longer offer anything in return. Against that backdrop, one man's attention stood out with real clarity. Paul Vario, the capo whose crew Henry belonged to, the same man whose own son had unknowingly set Karen and Henry up on their first date nearly a decade earlier, began paying Karen a kind of attention the rest of the crew was conspicuously withholding. Whether that attention began as genuine concern or carried an ulterior motive from the start is impossible to say with full certainty from the outside. What's documented, in Henry's own later account and in the reporting that followed it, is exactly where that attention eventually led. Chapter 10. The Affair as It Actually Happened. According to Henry Hill's own 1994 memoir, Gangsters and Goodfellas, Karen was involved with Paul Vario during the specific stretch of the 1974 sentence, the same stretch during which the rest of the crew had largely abandoned her both financially and socially. Sit with the audacity of that for a second, because it's easy to read past the sentence without weighing what it actually meant. Karen wasn't simply cheating on an absent husband with some available man from her social circle. She was involved with her husband's boss, the capo whose blessing determined which jobs Henry got, which protections extended to his family, and, ultimately, whether Henry lived or died if he ever crossed a line that mattered. If word had reached Henry inside prison walls, the way information often did travel through those walls, the consequences could have unraveled in directions nobody involved could fully control. The multiple published accounts of this relationship agree on the broad shape and disagree, or simply stay silent, on the finer details. There is no reliable public record establishing precisely how the affair began, whether it grew slowly out of Vario's early check-ins or arrived faster than that, and no reliable public record establishing exactly how long it lasted. What the record does establish, consistently across every published source, is that the relationship was real, that it occurred while Henry was incarcerated and unable to protect himself or his marriage, and that its consequences reached well past the 2 people directly involved. Why it happened is probably layered rather than singular, and the honest version resists a tidy explanation. Karen was isolated in a way that made a dangerous emotional connection recognizably human, regardless of the criminal context surrounding it. She was also, in more practical terms, dependent in ways a relationship with the single most powerful man in the crew could meaningfully ease. Vario had the standing to ensure Karen and her children received support the rest of the crew had been withholding. Whether the affair began from genuine feeling, practical calculation, or some blend the 2 people involved never fully separated even for themselves, the effect was consistent. Once the relationship deepened, Karen's position inside the crew's informal support structure improved. This is where the story Goodfellas chose not to tell intersects directly with one of the film's most disturbing sequences, the assault carried out against Karen by Tommy DeSimone. The film shows the assault. It does not show, or even gesture toward, the reason Paul Vario responded to it with the kind of lethal fury that would eventually end DeSimone's life. Chapter 11. What Tommy Did. According to Henry's own account, sometime during his imprisonment, Tommy DeSimone attempted to rape Karen. This is one of the darkest and least examined details in the entire Goodfellas story, acknowledged openly by Henry in his later writing, but never dramatized on screen with anything close to the weight the underlying facts suggest it deserved. Tommy DeSimone, the volatile, murderous associate whose temper made him one of the most feared men in Vario's crew, the man Joe Pesci would eventually build an Oscar-winning performance around, turned that same violence directly on Karen while her husband sat in federal prison, unable to protect her. The specifics have never been fully or consistently documented beyond Henry's own retelling, written decades after the fact, filtered through the particular unreliability of a man reconstructing his wife's trauma secondhand from inside a marriage that had already collapsed by the time he sat down to write about it. What stays consistent across every version that exists is the basic shape. DeSimone beat Karen and attempted to force himself on her, an assault that stopped short of completion but left no ambiguity about intent. Karen did not go to the police. That option barely existed in any real sense for a woman in her position, married to an incarcerated Lucchese associate, embedded in a world that handled its own violence internally and treated outside law enforcement involvement as a betrayal more serious than the original crime. What she did instead was tell Paul Vario. Vario, by the most widely reported version of events, did not take it well. The theory that has circulated most consistently in accounts of DeSimone's eventual murder holds that Vario's fury over the assault on Karen became one of the deciding factors, alongside DeSimone's other unauthorized killings and the mounting heat he'd been drawing down on the crew, in the decision to have him killed. According to this account, Vario arranged DeSimone's death by feeding word to the Gambino family that DeSimone had killed their own made man, Billy Batts, knowing the revelation alone would seal DeSimone's fate without Vario's own crew needing to pull a trigger directly. If this version is accurate, and it remains a theory rather than a confirmed fact even now, then Karen's assault did not simply vanish into the same silence that swallowed so much of the violence surrounding her family. It became, indirectly, the specific spark that ended a man's life. Tommy DeSimone may well have died, at least in part, because he attacked the wife of an associate who happened, at the exact moment his crime became known, to be sleeping with the single most powerful man in the entire organization. There's a bitter, almost unbearable irony sitting inside that sequence. A husband in prison couldn't protect her. The crew's formal structures, the one supposedly built to extend loyalty to an incarcerated associate's family, had already shown their limits during Henry's sentence. It was the affair, the one detail the movie erased entirely, that put Karen in a position where an act of violence against her actually carried consequences for the man who committed it. Chapter 12. Henry comes home. Henry was eventually released, and the marriage that resumed outside prison walls was not the marriage that had existed before his sentencing began. Both had changed in ways neither articulated fully to the other, at least not in any account that survives. Henry came out harder in some ways, more reckless in others, increasingly drawn toward the drug trafficking that would define the final and most dangerous chapter of his criminal career. Karen came out of the preceding years carrying a secret that, whether or not Henry ever learned its full details, shaped how she moved around Paul Vario and the men closest to him for the rest of her marriage. Whether Henry ever knew the full truth about Karen and Vario is genuinely unclear from the available record. His own later account acknowledges the affair happened, but the tone he applies to it, decades later, in a memoir written well after the marriage's collapse, reads more like a man processing a betrayal from a safe emotional distance than a man reconstructing a discovery that shattered him in real time. It's entirely possible he learned about it only much later, long after any confrontation could have mattered, and simply folded it into the larger, chaotic account of his marriage. What's clear is that the marriage, upon his release, did not return to stability. Henry's dealing accelerated. The household's finances, always precarious, took on a new and more dangerous character, tied directly to narcotics rather than the more traditional rackets that had defined his earlier earning. Karen resumed managing the household's practical needs, a role that increasingly meant participating directly in concealing evidence of an expanding drug operation running out of her own home. This stretch of the marriage, the years between Henry's release and his final 1980 arrest, gets comparatively little attention in most retellings, overshadowed by the more cinematic drama bookending it. The Lufthansa heist on one side, the arrest and the flip on the other. It's worth pausing on, because it marks the point where Karen's participation reached its most direct and legally exposed form. She was no longer simply the wife who understood what her husband did. She was an active operational participant in a federal narcotics case waiting to happen. Chapter 13. Living under Burke's Paranoia. The Lufthansa heist itself, the December 1978 robbery that pulled close to $6 million in cash out of a cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport, happened almost entirely outside Karen's direct involvement, orchestrated by Jimmy Burke with Henry playing a supporting role. But the aftermath shaped her daily life just as much as it shaped Henry's. even though she had no hand in planning or executing the robbery itself. Living inside a household connected to a crew gripped by that specific kind of institutional paranoia meant living with a constant, low background hum of danger that had nothing to do with the ordinary risks of Henry's earlier work. Associates were disappearing. Men who had eaten dinner at Karen and Henry's table were turning up dead, in car trunks, in shallow graves, some of which were never found at all. Karen understood exactly what those disappearances meant. She had built the criminal literacy to know precisely how thin the line ran between Henry staying inside the crew's good graces and Henry becoming one more name on the list. This period tested the exact skill she had spent more than a decade developing, reading a dangerous room and calibrating her own behavior to it. She had to raise 2 children, maintain the appearance of ordinary domestic life, and stay fully aware that any given man currently walking through her front door might be dead within weeks at the order of men who were also, still, walking through her front door. By the time federal investigators, having spent months building a case against Burke's crew for Lufthansa and the murders that followed it, turned their attention squarely on Henry, the household Karen had spent years constructing was already absorbing pressure from every direction it could come from. The arrest that finally brought the whole structure down did not arrive from clear skies. It arrived as the last of a long sequence of blows to a household that had barely any slack left to absorb it. Chapter 14. The Bust. Federal narcotics agents arrested Henry Hill in the spring of 1980, and this arrest, unlike the extortion charge that had sent him away in 1974, carried consequences neither Henry nor Karen could realistically absorb through the crew's usual protections. The mugshot survives. 2 faces, booked together, the physical evidence that Karen was not simply questioned and released that day, but taken into custody alongside her husband. What the surviving record does not establish, despite the framing sometimes applied to it in retrospective accounts, is a separate federal prosecution of Karen carried out in the years following Henry's cooperation. What it does establish is this. On the day the entire architecture of her marriage collapsed, Karen Hill was arrested at the scene, booked, and photographed, a direct and physical consequence of 2 decades spent inside an operation she understood in granular detail. The hours immediately following that arrest have never been documented in the kind of minute-by-minute detail some retrospective accounts imply exists. What is documented is the shape of the decision that followed within days. Henry's options, once the case against him solidified, narrowed to 2. He could take the sentence, serve the time, and trust the crew to take care of Karen and the children in his absence, the way it was supposed to and had conspicuously failed to during his 1974 sentence. Or he could cooperate, trading testimony against Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, and the rest of his former associates for a reduced sentence and a new identity for the entire family, permanently severing every connection to the world Karen had spent 15 years learning to navigate. Karen's perspective on this choice rarely gets the weight it deserves in popular retellings, which tend to center Henry's own calculation, his fear of a long sentence, his instinct for self-preservation that had, by his own later admission, always run stronger than any code of loyalty he claimed to believe in. Her stake in the same decision was every bit as direct. Staying inside the life meant repeating 1974's isolation, this time without the ambiguous protection her relationship with Vario had once offered, protection that had already failed her once when it came to Tommy DeSimone. Cooperating meant permanent exile from everything and everyone she had built her adult identity around, in exchange for a category of danger managed by federal marshals rather than left entirely to the discretion of men whose loyalty had already proven conditional. Neither option offered anything resembling safety in an uncomplicated sense. What cooperation offered, in the end, was a different and arguably more survivable kind of danger. Chapter 15. New Names. Henry agreed to testify. The government, in exchange, placed Henry, Karen, and their 2 children into the witness protection program. New names, and not only for Henry, whose testimony made him the obvious target, but for Karen and both children, since any of them could be used as leverage or targeted directly out of pure vengeance by men whose careers and freedom Henry's testimony was actively ending. New Social Security numbers. New backstories built to survive casual scrutiny from neighbors, co-workers, classmates who had no reason to suspect the family living down the street had any connection to organized crime whatsoever. The family relocated repeatedly over the following years, moving through towns and states with no prior connection to any of them, chosen for distance and disconnection from anything tied to New York or the Lucchese family. Reports place the family at various points in Seattle, Cincinnati, Omaha, Butte, and Independence, Kentucky, a geographic scatter reflecting both the program's deliberate strategy of maximizing distance and, more troublingly, a pattern of forced relocations tied directly to Henry's repeated inability to stay out of trouble even under a new identity. This is where witness protection, as Karen actually lived it, diverges sharply from any romanticized version of a fresh start. Henry did not use the clean slate to build a stable, law-abiding life. He kept drinking. He was arrested again on drug charges in Seattle in 1987, an incident serious enough that the family was formally expelled from the program that year. Each new incident, each moment of Henry drawing unwanted attention to a family that depended entirely on staying unnoticed, forced another relocation, another disruption for two children who were already carrying more instability than any childhood should have to absorb. Karen, once again, found herself managing the practical fallout of a husband whose choices kept destabilizing the very structure she was working to hold together. The specific skills she'd built over more than a decade inside organized crime, reading dangerous situations, managing household stability under unpredictable pressure, keeping two children functioning through chronic disruption, translated directly into what witness protection now demanded of her, applied to a different, and in some ways stranger category of danger. The threat was no longer a rival crew or a federal indictment. It was her own husband's inability to stay quiet, stay sober, and stay out of exactly the kind of trouble that risked exposing a location the government had built specifically to remain hidden. Chapter 16, 1989. By 1989, the marriage that had survived a double date, an elopement, imprisonment, infidelity running in both directions, a federal drug case, and formal entry into witness protection, finally reached its actual breaking point. Karen and Henry separated that year. Though the divorce would not be finalized until 2002, a 13-year gap that reflects the practical and legal complications of formally divorcing, while both parties remained tangled inside a federal protection arrangement rather than any lingering reconciliation. What ended the marriage, after everything else it had already survived, was not one final dramatic betrayal, but something closer to exhaustion. The accumulated weight of Henry's continued instability inside the program, his ongoing struggles with alcohol, and the fundamental impossibility of building a normal life together once the criminal enterprise that had, in its own dysfunctional way, organized their entire relationship for 2 decades, was gone. Karen had spent 15 years becoming genuinely skilled at managing a household inside organized crime. Witness protection asked her to manage a household organized around nothing except her husband's ongoing failure to stay out of trouble. And that particular challenge, stripped of the shared purpose and glamour that had once made the earlier version of their marriage feel worth its dangers, proved to be the one she wasn't willing to keep absorbing indefinitely. Greg and Gina, both approaching adulthood by the time their parents formally separated, carried their own complicated inheritance from this entire arc, one Gina would eventually process publicly decades later in her 2004 memoir On the Run, A Mafia Childhood. That book offers some of the clearest surviving documentation of what Karen's daily parenting actually looked like across the family's most chaotic years, filtered through a daughter's memory rather than a father's self-serving retrospective. Henry went on to build a strange, uncomfortable kind of second-act celebrity in the years following Goodfellas' release, trading on his story in cookbooks, public appearances, and interviews, a level of public visibility that sat oddly against the entire original premise of witness protection. Karen took a different path entirely, one defined far more by absence than by any effort to capitalize on the fame the film brought to her own life. Chapter 17. The film that wasn't about her. Goodfellas premiered in 1990, turning the private catastrophe of Karen Hill's marriage into one of the most celebrated crime films ever made, watched by millions of people who had no idea the woman on screen, played by an actress nominated for an Academy Award for the role, was based on a real, living person the actress had never once met. Lorraine Bracco did not meet Karen Hill before or during filming. Goodfellas is told almost entirely from Henry's perspective, adapted from a book built primarily around Henry's own account, filtered through Nicholas Pileggi's reporting. Karen's version of the same 2 decades, the version that would have included her own perspective on the affair with Vario, on the specific texture of her isolation during Henry's imprisonments, on her own criminal knowledge and active participation rather than just her reaction to Henry's, never made it into the source material in any comparably detailed way, and so it never reached the screen either. What the film did capture, filtered entirely through Henry's memory, was a version of Karen audiences found genuinely sympathetic. A woman initially dazzled by the glamour of mob life, gradually worn down by her husband's infidelity and violence, eventually complicit in his crimes but never quite as culpable as the men around her. That version isn't false exactly. It's incomplete in exactly the ways that make Karen's actual story harder to compress and, arguably, considerably more interesting than the film had room to explore. Henry embraced his own public identity as the film's central figure for the rest of his life, calling the movie roughly 95% accurate in various interviews, leaning into the fame it brought him rather than shying away from it. Karen's response to the film's release and its cultural afterlife has been almost entirely private by comparison. There is no public record of her granting interviews to discuss her own reaction to watching a version of her life dramatized for a mass audience. No public commentary on Bracco's performance. No visible participation in the ongoing cultural conversation around a film that made her, whether she wanted the distinction or not, one of the most recognizable mob wives in American cultural history. This is worth naming plainly, because it directly contradicts a version of this story, sometimes assumed rather than verified. Karen Hill is not, based on the available public record, given documented interviews correcting Scorsese's version of events. She has instead done close to the opposite. Whatever her private thoughts on the film's accuracy, she has kept them private, consistently, for more than 3 decades. Chapter 18. The Other Wives. Karen did not navigate any of this alone, and understanding her requires understanding the small, tight network of women who lived alongside her inside Vario's crew. Women whose lives ran on strikingly similar rules and who, collectively, formed something like a shadow support system operating entirely outside anything their husbands controlled. Mickey Burke, Jimmy Burke's wife, occupied a position not unlike Karen's own, married to a man whose earning power and violence both ran well above the crew's average, raising children inside a household that swung between extravagance and danger with a rhythm that had nothing to do with ordinary domestic planning. Karen and Mickey knew each other well, moved through overlapping social circles built around the same restaurants and holiday gatherings, and shared an unspoken understanding of what could and couldn't be discussed even among women who genuinely trusted one another. You didn't share everything, even with another wife who understood exactly what your husband did, because the same silence protecting the men from prosecution protected the women from becoming liabilities to each other. This network functioned as an informal training ground, a place where newer wives learned the specific etiquette of survival from women who'd already been doing it for years. How to answer a call from a man you didn't recognize without giving away information you shouldn't. How to read the quality of silence that meant a husband had had a bad night versus a genuinely dangerous one. How to manage children's questions about a father's absence without lying so completely the lie became fragile, or telling so much truth a child might repeat something dangerous at school. Karen, by most accounts, became relatively skilled within this network, tracking with everything else on record about her temperament from the Ted incident forward. But skill inside that network came with costs rarely acknowledged. The same women supporting each other through ordinary hardship were also, necessarily, competing for a limited kind of protection and status that flowed downward from their husband's standing. Karen's own position shifted considerably across her marriage, rising during Henry's successful earning stretches, contracting sharply during his 1974 imprisonment when the same women who might once have helped largely receded. It's worth naming what this reveals plainly. The women inside Paul Vario's crew were not simply passive dependents of the men who committed the crimes. They built and maintained an entire parallel social economy, running alongside the criminal one, but never fully separate from it. Karen's isolation during Henry's 1974 sentence wasn't only a matter of men failing to provide financial support. It was also, and perhaps more painfully, a matter of the women's network contracting around her precisely when she needed it most. Chapter 19. What the Children Carried. Gina Hill's 2004 memoir remains one of the most valuable documents available for understanding Karen Hill's actual parenting, precisely because it approaches the family story from an angle almost entirely absent everywhere else. A child's memory of what it felt like to live inside that specific chaos day to day, rather than an adult retrospective built around criminal chronology and courtroom outcomes. What emerges is a mother who worked constantly, in ways both visible and invisible, to preserve some baseline sense of normalcy for her children, even as the actual structure of their lives kept collapsing and reforming around them. The pistol-whipping story that opens so much discussion of Karen's early relationship with Henry comes from Gina's own retelling of a story her mother told her, passed down not as confession or warning, but as something closer to family lore, told with a mixture of humor and pride rather than shame. That detail alone says something about how Karen ultimately processed her own choices, at least in the version of herself she presented to her children as an adult looking back. Greg Hill has generally maintained a lower public profile than his sister, participating less directly in the public storytelling around the family's history, though he's acknowledged in various contexts as having lived through the same relocations, the same constant undercurrent of danger, and the same eventual family collapse. Both children, by every available account, emerged from an extraordinarily disruptive childhood without repeating their father's criminal path, a fact that reflects, at minimum, some meaningful success on Karen's part in raising children who understood the difference between their family's history and their own available choices. The relocations themselves deserve specific attention. Moving a family multiple times across several states, under new names, with new invented histories that needed to hold up under casual scrutiny from teachers and new friends, represents a level of sustained logistical and psychological management that fell disproportionately on Karen as the parent responsible for daily functioning, while Henry continued struggling with the dependency and impulse control problems that kept destabilizing the family's protected status. What both children ultimately did with this inheritance, publishing their own account rather than remaining as silent as their mother chose to stay, represents its own quiet rebellion against the family's foundational rule of discretion. Karen taught her children, through nearly 2 decades of lived example, exactly how to keep dangerous secrets contained. Gina, at least, eventually chose to tell one anyway, on her own terms and in her own voice. Chapter 20. The Woman the Movie Missed. Strip the film adaptation away entirely, and what remains is a considerably more complicated figure than the sympathetic, occasionally overwhelmed wife Lorraine Bracco brought to the screen. The real Karen Hill understood, from very early in her relationship with Henry, exactly what world she was entering, and chose that world repeatedly across 2 decades rather than being swept into it once and carried along passively from there. She held a warm pistol in her hands after her boyfriend beat a man in the street and found the moment thrilling rather than terrifying. She built genuine, functional expertise in the mechanics of organized crime, from hijacking operations to loan sharking to the concealment of narcotics from federal investigators, expertise substantial enough that she was booked and photographed alongside her husband on the day the entire operation came apart. She had an affair with her husband's boss during his imprisonment, a relationship that may have directly influenced the murder of one of the most feared men in the entire Goodfellas story. And she paid for all of it, not through a separate prosecution the record doesn't support, but through everything else the record does. The isolation of 1974, the arrest of 1980, the total severance of witness protection, a marriage that took 13 years to formally end, and a fame she never asked for and has spent more than 3 decades declining to comment on. None of this fits comfortably into either the sympathetic victim narrative the film leans toward or a simple villain narrative that would be just as reductive in the other direction. What emerges instead, once you assemble the full documented record rather than the compressed and Henry-centered version that made it into Wise Guy and then Goodfellas, is a woman who made active, consequential choices across 2 decades inside one of the most dangerous criminal environments in American history, who paid real and specific costs for those choices, and who ultimately survived them with more intact stability than several of the men who shared her table over those same 20 years. Karen Friedman came from a quiet street in Lawrence, Long Island, raised to marry well and live an unremarkable, comfortable life. Instead, she learned the rules of the Lucchese family faster and more thoroughly than most men born into it, survived the husband's repeated betrayals by matching them with one of her own, and walked away from the wreckage with her children, her freedom, and as far as the record shows, her life intact. Hollywood gave that story to someone else to tell. This is the version she actually lived.